Good evening, guys. It is Monday, February 17th, 2025. This bathrobe business. I'm Georgi Oganov. I don't have my bathrobe, but I do have my decaf coffee. So let's jump into it. So today's a bank holiday. It's a national holiday or federal holiday. I think it's a national holiday. I think federal holidays, no, reverse that. I think federal holidays means if you work for anything related to the federal government, it's a day off. But if it's a national holiday, everybody gets the day off. I think that's how it works. Doesn't matter. Anyway, today's a holiday. So it's kind of a quiet day. There's not too much to talk about, but there's a couple major stories that I'm going to discuss. I shouldn't say that. There's a couple small stories I'm going to discuss, and then one major story I'm going to discuss. So the first thing I want to talk about is retail. So as you guys remember, I have talked a lot about retail in the last 6 months or so. Since the beginning of September, we've seen rapid growth and acceleration in the retail space. I started talking about this like in September, October. We saw fantastic numbers coming out in November and even better in December. We had fantastic numbers overall. Now, a lot of these companies haven't even reported earnings yet for the fourth quarter, but a lot of them are probably going to report very strong earnings in general. Now, the new sales numbers for January are out, and that's where things can get a little bit mixed. So I was expecting a little bit worse numbers than we got because, as we talked about on this channel, I think 2025 is shaping up to be kind of a regressive year. It's going to be, I think, a year of contraction. There's another story that kind of underpins that, but retail seems to be actually holding fairly strong. So if you look at the headline, retail sales in January were down by about 0.9% from January to December. So that sounds scary. That's where a lot of people will freak out and say, oh, so retail is finally plummeting. Well, not really, because retail sales in January were actually up 4.8% year over year. This is just about the December to January change is just the usual cyclical nature of the year, because obviously December is a major sales month for retail, and then it regresses in January, starts to recover a little bit in February, and then we hit spring tax refund season, and things kind of get back to normal. So this pattern is actually very cyclical, very predictable, very normal. Overall, retail is actually still doing very well. We're still seeing a 4.8 increase year over year. And this year's contraction was actually less than it was last year. In fact, there were only 2 Januaries with a smaller plunge, 2023 and 2021. So overall, we're seeing very strong retail sales continuing with large numbers and growth coming out. So I think, even though I'm the one being kind of the pessimist here, saying that 2025 might be a bit of a contraction, retail is actually holding up fairly well. Now, to kind of parallel that, let's go to restaurants. So restaurants warn of weaker quarter, but say sales will pick up later. Now, I don't believe the second half of this article, the fact that sales will pick up later this year, because that's just a speculative prediction used to bolster their stock price. But this kind of runs counter to the retail numbers. So Chipotle, Wendy's, and McDonald's are among the chains predicting strong results in the second half of the year, but are warning against bad numbers in the front part of the year. Many saw declines in sales, including 1.4% decline in U.S. same-store sales. Now, fast food net sales rose about 3.4% in January compared with a year ago, but the growth was down slightly from December's 4.9% high. So you're seeing a steeper drop-off in restaurants in regards to December and January. And restaurants, while they do have a little bit of a cyclical nature, because if you're out shopping, you're going to go out and eat, etc., you still don't usually see that big of a drop. That's a little bit different. Restaurants aren't as seasonal in relation to purchases as something like retail is. So I think restaurants are another one of those sectors that's underpinning kind of my theory of a slowdown in growth for 2025. In kind of related news, which actually isn't necessarily related, Southwest Airlines is planning to slash about 15% of their corporate jobs. An unprecedented move. In fact, over most of its history, Southwest doesn't really cut or restructure much. Now, this is in response to the activist pressure that they've been facing. I report on this probably early last year, mid last year, that they were facing activist pressure from I don't remember the company's name, but I know it's somewhere in this article. Elliott Investment Management, which actually won 5 board seats on the Southwest board, but just short of control. But that's still enough to put pressure on Southwest. We reported the fact that they were going to be changing from kind of the free for all where you can go and sit anywhere you want to assigned seating. And they were going to be coming with premium products like extra leg room and probably eventually segmenting into different classes, which originally Southwest just never did. But this is probably their most aggressive move so far, where they're planning to cut about 1,700 jobs, 1,750 to be exact, and about 210 million for this year, and an additional 300 million in 2026. So these layoffs are no joke. Now, this is not response to economic pressure. This is just company restructuring, because every time we look at travel, it's actually doing very well. We haven't gotten very recent numbers since the start of the year, but overall, usually this number for the last, well, pretty much since COVID has just been accelerating. We've been seeing very strong numbers with growth in travel and with the luxury travel, especially overseas and upgrades. So I don't think this is indicative of the sector. This is one of the few things that kind of counteracts my theory about 2025, but still a major change and a major restructure. Last story I'm going to talk about is going to be the Fed, a couple statements that came out of the Fed today. So the first is going to be from Michelle Bowman, who I've talked about on this channel before. She was always the more, I guess, depending on your perspective, more dovish, more hawkish, but she was always more hesitant with cuts than every other Fed chair. I featured her multiple times on this channel because she always seemed to be the voice of reason counteracting cuts. She came out with a statement today that says, the Fed is still going to wait before it makes any further cuts, etc. Nothing unusual. But then there was a statement there that did not make sense to me. Well, it makes sense to me. I just can't believe it's coming out of the Fed's mouth. So the statement she said was, while she expects inflation to continue to decelerate this year, she said disinflation may take longer than we would hope. So that's a big statement. It may not seem like it, but it is. And in fact, I had to scroll down into the article to be like, well, that couldn't be what she said. But in fact, she did. Let me find the exact line. Let me see the current policy. I cannot find the exact, even though this is a very short article, I know she specifically said disinflation. While she expects inflation to continue to decelerate this year, she said disinflation may take longer than we hope. So why this is a big line? So this is, sorry for taking so long to find, but this is kind of a major statement. We all know about inflation. We've talked about it ad nauseum. It's become common practice to talk about it around the dinner table. Disinflation is kind of a taboo word in economics, especially with economists. Now, there's no good reason for this. Actually, I'll argue that disinflation is what capitalism is all about. I'll make that statement in just a second. But when it comes to economists believe that disinflation is always a bad thing, that it could lead to destabilization in the market, it can cut demand, it could cut growth, etc. Now, that argument doesn't make sense. It's one of those things of like, economists are kind of like astrologers. It's fun to listen to them, but it's all bullshit 90% of the time. And that may seem like an aggressive statement, but let me reiterate what their position is. They believe that when the price of products fall, it actually means you're going to buy less of it. Now, I don't know how you guys do your purchases when you go out into the real world, but normally when I see prices are going up, I buy less. And when prices are going down, I buy more. Now, one of their theories behind this is to get ahead of inflation, people will intentionally purchase things now in order to save money so that they don't spend more money in the future. And that sounds great on a dot plot and an Excel sheet. Unfortunately, no human being on earth operates that way. When things are expensive, people buy it. When things are, when things are expensive, people don't buy it. And when things are cheap, people buy it. That's how everybody operates. Nobody calculates the future cost of a product when they're out shopping. with the exception of the occasional sales, where even I think a lot of people are hip to the fact that most sales are bullshit 90% of the time because it's always the same price just being recycled over and over. That's kind of an old retail secret. I used to work at Sears. We would literally change the signs and would have the exact same price. The only thing that would change was the date. So most people just simply buy stuff based off of what their budgets can afford. So this is where the economist idea completely breaks down. Furthermore, economists don't seem to understand that when prices start to fall, and you can actually save money in one sector, it transplants to growth in another. That never seems to enter their paradigm. And finally, why I made that bold statement a second ago was the entire point of capitalism was disinflation. Is technically, as things progress, their prices should drop. And this is actually intuitive, right? This is the invisible hand of the market, classic Milton Friedman economics. If you're manufacturing something and you want to beat your competitor, you're automatically going to try to undercut the cost of production. And by doing that, you're going to innovate the manufacturing process. So by performing the basic art of capitalism, of trying to beat your competitor, you are driving costs down. And this isn't actually that uncommon. And for most of our history, this was kind of a fact, right? I mean, cars used to be incredibly expensive, but through mass manufacturing, their prices disinflated and they've come down in cost. Whereas in 1905, only millionaires could afford cars. Now, most lower middle class people can afford cars. This is true for every sector, and this is true of every single product ever manufactured. This is the whole point of why capitalism is supposed to be better than communism. See reference to flag behind me. So the argument that disinflation is always bad is just ridiculous. It goes counter to what the tenets of capitalism actually are. Now, why I bring this up is it's very strange for an economist to say that. It's very strange for the Fed to say that. And this has never been the Fed's policy. This has never in history been the Fed's policy to disinflate prices. In fact, even last year, when the Fed was making progress with inflation, Jerome Powell said that a lot of people are upset by the fact that prices are not going back down. But that's not the duty of the Fed. The duty of the Fed is to stop the acceleration. It is not the duty of the Fed to reverse the direction of the market. And that's true. Just by raising interest rates, the Fed can't change the price of a consumer good or a product. All they could do is stop the acceleration of its growth. It's up to the free market to do that. But the goal of the Fed has never been to disinflate the market. In fact, you could argue that that is counter to what the Fed is supposed to do because it's run by economists who say that disinflation is bad. So why are they saying this? This is where it can get a little bit conspiratorial. Now, this isn't entirely conspiracy theory. This is pretty much common fact. But to understand this, we're going to go across the pond to Britain. And I'm going to share an article from like 2 years ago. So few people remember Liz Truss because she was actually the shortest, the prime minister with the shortest term in history. Her tenure only lasted about 45 days, or was it 49 days? Something like that. Wasn't even 2 months. But one of the things that happened with her administration was a major bond crisis. Now, this is where the conspiracies start to come in. Some people say that Liz was sabotaged by the Central Bank of Britain, the BOE, the Bank of the Bank of England, their central bank, their equivalent to our Federal Reserve, and that they caused this bond crisis because they were trying to get rid of her. That I don't know. That is impossible to say, and better minds than me have debated it. I would recommend referring to a couple of different podcasts. Multipolarity, I talk about it all the time on this channel. They've talked about this in depth. Unheard is a great podcast that deals specifically, I shouldn't say specifically, but they lean heavily into British politics because they are a British podcast, even though there are some American correspondents on that podcast. They talk ad nauseum what happened with Liz Truss. But why I think it parallels is Liz was coming in and making major changes to the infrastructure and the economic policy of Britain, specifically cutting taxes. This spurred the idea that it was going to cause massive inflation. The bond market destabilized because everybody thought that the Bank of England was going to raise interest rates, and insanity ensued. Now, why I think that's an interesting parallel is right now we are facing major economic instability. Now, while I'm not going to become conspiratorial and say that the Fed is purposely going to sabotage Donald Trump, I think what we're getting is a glimpse into what might happen with our bond markets. Especially, I'm not going to get conspiratorial because in England, a prime minister can get thrown out after 45 days. In the United States, that's a parliamentary system. In the United States, that doesn't happen. We're a federal republic. The structure of the government is different. But I think it does forecast what could happen in a Trump-Fed relationship economy, where we could see rises in interest rates, and we could see the Fed actively trying to take a role in deflating the market in order to control the bond market. I think this furthers the idea that I think 2025 is going to be very tempered and we could see major retraction. But I think we could also see a Fed that is very aggressive against the government of the United States, not in a conspiratorial way, but in an opposing force. If they're seeing that inflation is coming in, they're going to try to take measures and pull levers in order to pull that inflation back. And not just in a normal fashion, but actually aiming for disinflation, which would be unheard of in economics. I don't know, maybe in the comments you guys can tell me. I'm not an economist. I just follow this. And I've never seen the Federal Reserve actively taking a role in disinflating a market. But I don't know how else to interpret a statement like that when they're clearly coming out and saying, disinflation hasn't made the progress we have seen, when that was never the plan. So again, not being conspiratorial, but just kind of throwing it out there that I think that in the next 2-3 quarters, we're going to see major opposition and major head-to-heads between the Federal Reserve and the Trump administration. We could see the potential of a bond crisis, and we could see major changes in how the Federal Reserve operates. Now, in England, there were major repurchases of bonds, a massive quantitative easing. That could happen here as well. That could be one of the levers that the Fed decides to pull. But there's no telling how the market can react to that. If quantitative easing goes into effect, it could spur inflation because obviously it's printing money into the system. But it could also cause a market panic because people may think that the Fed needs to step in simply because the market is so unstable. So I would keep a close eye to what happens in the next couple of months. I don't know. I'm not making any predictions. I'm just saying that I think there's some parallels to draw here between our bond market and the bond market of England just 2-3 years ago. So that's pretty much it. That's the stories of the day. I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. Hopefully it didn't get too weird for you. And I'll see you guys back here tomorrow. Hope you have a productive Tuesday. Bye.